Hi, I'm Mel Van Dusen, and welcome to the show. Today, our guest is Dr. Stanislav Grof. And Dr. Grof is one of the major pioneer researchers into the area of non-ordinary states of consciousness for the purpose of healing, insight, and personal growth. Dr. Grof got his M.D. from Charles University in Prague in 1957. He went on to get a Ph.D. in medicine from the Czechoslovakia Academy of Science in 1965, where he did training work as a Freudian psychoanalyst. He was assistant chief of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and was chief of psychiatry at the Maryland Psychiatric Clinic. From 1973 to 1985, he was scholar in residence at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, and he's the founding president of the International Transpersonal Association and one of the founders of holotropic breathwork. I am very, very honored to have as my guest today Dr. Grof. Dr. Grof, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Dr. Grof, you are one of those people who have changed the consciousness of people through your research. Could you talk to us briefly about how you got started in this and what changed you personally?
Well, initially I had no idea that I would become a physician, that I would become a psychiatrist. I had completely different interests. My interests were in art. I like to paint, I like to draw. And I was fascinated by animated movies. And actually, when I finished, what in this country would be high school, we call it gymnasium in Europe, I had my initial interview with the man who was a really, really excellent artist. He got a lot of gold medals in Cannes and other places for his movies, and he was my personal hero. And I had the interview and I was accepted. I was supposed to start working in the Barrandov film studios in Prague. And just at that time, a friend of mine gave me introductory lectures to psychoanalysis, and I read it overnight. I couldn't sleep. I read it in one sitting, and within a few days I decided it's not going to be animated movies, it would be psychoanalysis. So I had to enroll in medical school, and I joined a group of, very small group of psychoanalysts who were working in Prague, basically who survived the war. You know, many of the psychoanalysts who didn't leave Czechoslovakia ended in gas chambers.
How was Freud viewed during that time? You were there with the Nazi occupation and then again during the communist takeover. So how was Freud viewed?
Well, during the Nazi occupation, Freud was Jewish. He was also a member of a Masonic lodge, and so those were major enemies of Nazi Germany. So any books related to psychoanalysis ended up in these piles in the streets that were actually burned. Those were, blacklisted books. Then after the war, we had 3 years of freedom where the libraries were able to bring some of the books back. And then when the communists came, the situation repeated itself for different reasons. Here, Freud was seen as a kind of lackey of the capitalists, of the bourgeoisie. The idea that he created psychoanalysis to ridicule the revolutionary movement. The revolutionaries have unresolved Oedipal problems and so on. And also he created a kind of a model of the psyche that would make it impossible to actually create a communist society. Because people are driven by very egotistic base instincts. Whereas the idea there was, there would be this kind of utopian situation where.
So you actually trained as a Freudian psychoanalyst?
Yes.
Yeah. And what was that training like?
Well,
you were in analysis for 7 years.
Well, I started when psychoanalysis was still acceptable, and then my personal training then happened after the communist putsch.
Mm-hmm.
And this was basically a personal agreement between me and my psychoanalyst that we couldn't talk about.
Right.
Nobody could know that because it was very dangerous for both of us.
How did you feel about the analysis?
You know, I loved every minute of it. I
Mhm.
loved to play with my dreams and to, find out that even every slip of the tongue had sort of profound meaning.
Uh-huh.
Now, if you ask me today, what did it do for you? Did it change you? I would say, well, I changed during those 7 years, but I have no convincing feeling that the changes had anything to do with the free association
Right.
and analysis. I mean, 7 years you change anyway.
Mhm. But during this time, you had an experience that did change you forever. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. Well, I was going through a very profound crisis where I started actually regretting that I chose psychoanalysis and I chose psychiatry, and I started kind of thinking.
You would have preferred to have done animated film.
Well, I got to the point that I started thinking back very nostalgically, the cartoons, This was a wrong choice of profession. I should have stayed with the animated movies.
Mm-hmm.
And then something happened that just, in one day changed my life professionally and personally.
Mm-hmm.
We got a sample of a new investigational substance called L.S.D. 25 that came from Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company, a company for which we worked with their preparations. And this came with a story that this was a fascinating investigation, a new substance. The powerful psychoactive properties of the substance were discovered by Dr. Albert Hoffman in the Sandoz laboratories when he actually accidentally intoxicated himself. The substance originally was supposed to relieve migraine headache or stop gynecological bleeding. Those were the two indications of the ergot alkaloids that this drug belongs to. And they did some initial pilot studies in Switzerland, and they came to the conclusion that this could be very interesting for psychiatrists, for psychologists. So they were now sending it all over the world. They were sending it to universities, research institutes, therapists, and so on. And they were asking the question, do you think there is any legitimate use for this substance in psychiatry and psychology? And they gave actually two suggestions on the basis of these preliminary experiments. One would be to use this substance as what they called model psychosis, experimental psychosis, where you could give it to quote-unquote normal people. You could do all kinds of tests before, during, and after, not just psychological tests, but biochemical tests, electrophysiological tests, and so on. And you would get an insight as to what's happening in the body when the mental functioning of these people is so profoundly influenced.
And this piqued your interest.
Yes. Well, the second tip actually was more interesting for me. They suggested that this maybe could be used as a very unconventional educational tool that psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, students, would have the chance to spend a few hours in a world that would be very much like the world of their patients. And as a result of it, they would be able to understand them better. They would be able to communicate with them and hopefully be more successful in treating them.
And so, to make a long story short, you tried it.
I became, one of the early volunteers, and I had a very, very powerful experience.
Tell us.
It was not just with LSD, but my preceptors was very interested in EEG, electroencephalography. And at the time when I was having the session, he was particularly interested in what's called driving the brain waves and training the brain waves, which means exposing people to either optical or acoustic frequencies, and then finding out if the brain waves of the corresponding parts of the brain would respond to it, if you can actually drive them.
So what happened
so
to you?
I had a combination really of LSD and then as my experience was speaking, I got this exposure to powerful stroboscopic light, and my consciousness was catapulted out of my body. I saw light like I'd never seen in my life. I couldn't even imagine existed. At the time I thought this is what it must have been like in Hiroshima. Today I think it was more like the primary clear light from the Tibetan Book of the Dead that we supposedly see at the time of our death.
Right.
And I lost the connection with the research assistant, with the clinic, with Prague, with the planet, and I had the feeling that there were no more boundaries. You know, I became all of existence. And then for some time later, I had the feeling I became the physical universe, where there were just incredible phenomena happening for which at the time I didn't have even a name. But later when I read about the Big Bang, the white holes, black holes, pulsars, it was something in that category.
So how did this experience cause you to see psychoanalysis and traditional psychiatry?
Well, I came down from that experience and I was very impressed.
Yes.
You know, and by that time I was very disappointed with psychiatry, with psychoanalysis. And so I felt, you know, if you are a psychiatrist, this is by far the most interesting area in psychiatry that you can study. So for the last, it's now over 50 years in that experiment, I've really done very little professionally that would not be related in one way or another to these non-ordinary states.
Right. You know, what interests me is that LSD is thought to be a man-made substance, which it is, and yet when you look at the chemical composition of, say, something like psilocybin, the magic mushrooms of Central America, what was discovered about the chemical similarity between LSD and psilocybin, let's say?
Well, you know, many of these psychedelic substances are indole derivatives. There's a certain combination of a benzene ring and a 5-carbon ring called indole. And you can find that as a core of all these substances. And, you know, we know them now in pure form. They have been not only isolated, but they have been synthesized. And LSD is not synthetic, but LSD is what's called semi-synthetic, because lysergic acid is something that's produced by ergot.
Yes.
It exists in nature, but the diethyl group has to be added in the laboratory. But then later, Dr. Hoffman continued this research. He identified psilocybin and psilocin from the magic mushrooms. And then he got another substance which is called ololuki in the native language, but it's basically morning glory seeds. And when he did the analysis of the active alkaloid, it was a monoethylamide of lysergic acid.
I see.
So Dr. Hoffman now believes that LSD actually, although it's semi-synthetic, that it belongs to the category of the Mesoamerican psychedelic substances that have been used for centuries.
And the Mesoamericans incorporated this into their culture.
Very much
and
so.
their religion.
Yeah, very much so.
And when you go back to you know, other places in the world, let's say Eleusis, the Greek mysteries, it's now thought that the people who participated in the mysteries said that their lives were dramatically changed. Their attitude toward life and death had become completely changed. For a long time, people didn't know what happened in these mysteries, and the mysteries went on for 2,000 years. But now it's thought that as they were entering the telesterion, the mystery chamber, and all the great minds of antiquity who spoke Greek, you know, wanted to participate in this, but they had perhaps had this experience.
Well, there's actually a book called Road to Eleusis, which was written by Dr. Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD, by Gordon Wasson, who was the one who brought the magic mushrooms from Mexico to Europe, and Karl Rag, who was a Greek scholar. And they came to the conclusion that the key to these mysteries was a sacred potion, which was called Kykeon, Kykeon. And they were able, after a lot of studies and also after some self-experiments of Dr. Hoffman, they actually concluded that it was an ergot preparation.
Mm-hmm.
So this was, the Eleusinian mystery was really a psychedelic religion.
Right. So we see a link between us and the past, and when people went through these mysteries, they often came out having lost their fear of death. And let's talk about near-death experiences. You've had some interest in that. I think people who have these experiences go through something very similar to people who've had experience with entheogens, which means to bring out the divine from within. Would you talk about the similarities between near-death experiences and the experiences that people have when they're on entheogens?
Well, we actually had a very interesting study, which was also the most moving one at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, which was the study using L.S.D. and also MDA and then dipropyltryptamine and other psychedelic substance with terminal cancer patients, people dying of cancer who had been given up by the surgeon. There was nothing more medically to offer. And we did this as a preparation for death, and we found out that they actually lost fear of death. And as a result of that, their day-to-day experience was profoundly changed. You know, they were able to live sort of one day at a time, appreciate whatever was left. So there was very, very dramatic changes in these people. And we had several instances where these cancer patients who had these experiences with us later, when the cancer advanced, had actually spontaneous, not spontaneous, but real near-death experiences.
Oh, really?
I wrote this very comprehensive book on death, which is called The Ultimate Journey, Consciousness and the Mystery of Death. And I described in some detail one of these patients, you know, who, when the cancer advanced, he had his urethra obstructed, and there was an operation, and he had cardiac arrest and had experience of clinical death, and then was resuscitated, and he came back, and we talked to him, and he said, I was very glad that I had these psychedelic sessions because the territory was not new to me.
Wow. So rather than being confronted with death for the first time and panicking and responding with fear, he responded with maybe an opening.
You know, there's also more in this effect of psychedelics than just the sense that you have been in a familiar territory. But there's also a certain powerful transformation that happens in that people came to the conclusion that they are not their bodies, because they can identify with many other things in that experience. And so they start looking at their body as something that they are using or that they inhabit temporarily. But their identification was something much larger. They don't see death as the end of everything.
Right. There's a quote from your book. In Western science and psychology, the history of the universe is the history of developing matter. Life, consciousness, and intelligence are accidental side products of matter. In a world where only what is measurable is real, there is no place for spirituality of any kind. Direct experience of spiritual realities is seen as manifestations of serious mental disease. Death of the body is seen as the end of conscious activity. Therefore, from this point of view, and it's the point of view that psychology has and also that science perhaps has, people like Ramakrishna, Jesus, Buddha were crazy.
We have many books and many articles, you know, saying what would be the best diagnosis for the founders of the religions, prophets, saints, and so on. So Ramakrishna certainly was called schizophrenic, Saint Teresa of Avila, severe hysterical psychotic, Saint John of the Cross, hereditary degenerative. And there's even an article by Franz Alexander, who's one of the founders of psychosomatic medicine, a psychoanalyst, in case you meditate, that puts even meditation into a pathological context. The paper is called Buddhist Training as Artificial Catatonia.
It's hopeless. Yeah. So, I think about your history in Prague, and the Nazis were there repressing ideas, then followed by the communists repressing ideas. You went through psychoanalysis in which the ideas and the experiences that liberated you were actually seen as maybe crazy. And so it occurs to me that science, religion, psychology, and to some extent even the government is against or anti-experiences which can open you up and not only cause you to lose your fear of death, but to lose your fear of living. What do you have to say about this?
Well, I think this is a result of a very narrow, very superficial model of the psyche that we have in Western psychology and psychiatry, which is limited to postnatal biography, basically, and to the Freudian individual unconscious, which is also a kind of a derivative of postnatal history, things that we have rejected, things that we have forgotten, and so on. So that, you see, anything that you cannot explain by this very, very narrow model is seen as a product of some yet to be discovered pathology.
Yes. So psychiatry.
So basically, it's a reflection of our, very, very superficial, very inadequate model. We don't have a category of a spiritual experience or a mystical experience.
You've once said, quote, "Very few people, including most scientists, realize that we have absolutely no proof that consciousness is actually produced by the brain."
That's true. Yeah, we have, of course, enormous amount of observations from clinical work and also experimental neurology, psychiatry, showing that there are significant correlations between the functioning of the brain and the states of consciousness. You have a temporal tumor, your consciousness is changed in a certain way, which is different from having a prefrontal tumor. Somebody hits you over the head, you lose consciousness, and so on. So we know that there are very, very close correlations, but where the logical jump happened is to see this as a proof that consciousness is actually generated in the brain. It would be as saying that because the quality of the program, television program, the sound and the picture depends on the functioning of the set, is a proof that the program is generated in the box.
Right.
So you see, all these observations just showing the correlation, and they leave open the possibility that consciousness is coming from somewhere else, that the brain is modulated or modulating or mediating consciousness, but it doesn't really generate it.
And then it causes one to think that it makes sense that a person with a near-death experience could actually leave his body and view himself, if that is the case.
Well, we have now some of the most convincing arguments against the fact that consciousness is possibly generated in the brain are these near-death experiences that you mentioned.
Right.
People who have the experience of clinical death and they observe their body from the ceiling and they decide to go and check what's happening in other parts of the building or experience something 3,000 miles away. People who are congenitally blind, organically blind, they had never seen anything. They can see when their consciousness.
And they can report to people what they've seen and have it verified?
Have it verified, yeah.
Wow.
Ken Ring, who did this research, calls it veridical out-of-body experiences. Not only do they see something, but you can get consensual validation by people who have the ability to see.
So here we're getting into a different way of viewing reality. And the view that we've had before of viewing reality was something called the Cartesian, Newtonian, monistic material worldview, Could you tell us briefly what that is?
Well, what Fritjof Capra called the Cartesian-Newtonian worldview is really a bit of Newton, bit of Descartes.
Mm-hmm.
And it is combined with monistic materialism, which was not the philosophy of either Descartes or Newton. This come from somewhere else. But basically it uses the principles of the Newtonian mechanics. At that time there were still atoms were the fundamental building blocks. So the idea was the universe is like this gigantic super machine that's built of these atoms. It exists in space, which is three-dimensional, time, which is linear. Everything is strictly deterministic. If you could somehow know the history of the universe, you could predict its future and so on.
Right. And therefore, consciousness depends on the body and what consciousness observes or senses through the senses.
Yes.
And there can be no knowledge outside of the senses or the input of the body.
Well, you know, the science actually accepts the possibility of certain realities that are invisible or not available to senses. But the idea is that we can sort of experience them through the extension of our senses, like the micro world, like the remote galaxies, or other electromagnetic radiation of other frequencies and so on.
Dr. Grof, this is getting into fascinating territory and we're running out of time. Could you come back and talk to us more about this?
Of course.
Good, wonderful, wonderful. I think I know where we're going, and it's really, really fascinating, this world that you have opened up through your own research. So I'd like to thank you so much for being on the show, and I very much look forward to having you on again.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.